Tonight, we reveal a secret that does not just change history, it changes time itself. A calendar we take for granted, marking our days, our years, our very sense of reality, was not born from the stars, but from power. For centuries, the Vatican has claimed to guide souls, yet behind its walls it also claimed something far greater, the authority to shape the clock of civilization. The Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, was not a harmless correction. It was a rewriting of memory, a reset of centuries, a tool to bend prophecy, empire, and belief into perfect alignment. This is not simply about leap years or the date of Easter. It is about 10 days erased in an instant. It is about lost centuries, forbidden timelines, and astronomical evidence that refuses to obey official history. It is about how the very framework of time was placed under lock and key so that generations would never realize they were living inside a script. Deep within the archives of Rome, the story of time itself has been hidden, guarded in silence. And tonight, we ask the question no one dares to voice. If the Vatican holds the clock, do we truly know what year it is? Like the video, subscribe. Because once you learn who keeps time, you will never look at history the same way again. What if everything you believe about time is not as solid as the ticking of a clock, but instead a story written by those who rule the world? Imagine this. Every second you count, every year you celebrate, every date written on a page is not just a natural truth, but a system chosen, shaped, and imposed. Time is not only the sun rising and setting, or the earth moving around the sun. It is the calendar you follow, the holidays you mark, and the hours you spend. And behind that calendar stands not nature, but power. The power to decide how humanity remembers its past and imagines its future. Think of this. You wake up one day, and the date is October 4th. You go to sleep, and when you wake, it is suddenly October 15th. 10 days are gone, vanished, as if they never existed. This is not science fiction. This actually happened in the year 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII changed the world's calendar. But here is the real question. Who gave him the right to erase those days from history? And why did the world follow? Time has always been more than numbers on a clock. For the ancients, it was measured by shadows of the sun, the phases of the moon, the rise and fall of stars. Farmers planted by it, priests prayed by it, and empires conquered by it. But when you look deeper, you see that time is not only observed, it is controlled. Whoever commands the calendar commands memory, and whoever shapes memory controls belief. Think of birthdays, anniversaries, even the year you believe you were born into. All of these are written in a system created centuries ago by men in power. Without their decisions, today might not be the year 2025. It could be something else entirely, perhaps earlier, perhaps later. We only know what we are told. And when you realize this, a shiver runs through your spine. What if the very number that defines your age, your century, your history, was chosen to make the world think a certain way? The calendar has never been neutral. It is not simply a tool to measure days, but a weapon to define reality. Ancient rulers used it to proclaim their reigns, to mark their victories, to erase their enemies. The Church later used it to anchor holy days, to fix Easter, to control when the faithful would fast, feast, or fear. Time became theology, it became law, and most of all, it became obedience. People did not question the dates written on their walls, because to question time itself was to question authority. So when you hear that the calendar you live by was created by the Vatican, do not imagine this was a small detail in history. It was a turning point. The day when time stopped belonging to the stars and the seasons, and instead became chained to the pen of men. Time, the most powerful illusion humanity has ever believed in, is not what you think it is. It has been written, edited, erased, and rewritten. And the deeper you dig, the more you begin to wonder, do we live by the rhythm of the cosmos, or by the silent command of those who once decided what time itself should mean? Long before the Vatican ever held the keys to time, humans were already watching the skies and carving their lives into cycles. Imagine standing in a field thousands of years ago with no phone, no clock, not even a calendar. All you had was the moon rising and falling, the sun stretching shadows across the earth, and the stars spinning overhead. For the first civilizations, these movements were not just pretty sights. They were the only way to survive. Farmers planted crops by the phases of the moon. Hunters moved with the seasons. Priests claimed they could read the will of the gods from the heavens. Time was not an abstract idea. It was life itself. The earliest calendars were lunar, based on the waxing and waning of the moon. Each month began with a sliver of light returning to the night sky. Simple, right? But there was a problem. 12 lunar cycles made only about 354 days. The year kept falling out of step with the seasons. Festivals that were supposed to honor the spring would sometimes drift into winter. Crops planted by one year's calendar could fail in the next. The moon alone was not enough. The Egyptians took things further. Living in a land ruled by the flooding of the Nile, they needed something more precise. They turned to the sun. They noticed that every year, just before the river rose, a bright star appeared in the dawn sky. It was Sirius, the dog star. By watching this moment, they built a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days. These were days of festivals, considered sacred and dangerous. It was one of the first times humanity tried to bind the chaos of nature into exact numbers. Across the ocean, the Maya in Central America went even further. They were not content with a simple solar calendar. They built a system so precise that it could predict eclipses and the movements of planets centuries ahead. They used a sacred cycle of 260 days and a solar cycle of 365 days, interlocking them like gears. Together, they formed a great calendar round of over 50 years. Even more astonishing, the Maya tracked a long-count calendar that stretched across thousands of years, almost like they were trying to capture eternity itself. It was not just timekeeping, it was a philosophy, a belief that history itself moved in cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The Romans, practical as always, borrowed from the Greeks and Egyptians. They used a lunar calendar at first, but ran into the same problem of drifting seasons. To fix it, they allowed priests to add or remove days at will. This meant politics seeped into time. If a ruler wanted to extend his power, he could simply stretch the calendar. Days became tools of manipulation. By the time of Julius Caesar, the system was so broken that the calendar was nearly 3 months off. Soldiers were fighting winter campaigns in autumn. Farmers were planting spring crops in summer. Each of these early clocks, whether lunar, solar, or mixed, revealed the same truth. Time is not just discovered, it is invented. The ancients stared at the skies, saw patterns, and then decided how to count them. And every decision carried consequences. When to plant, when to pray, when to go to war. It all rested on the numbers someone wrote down. The ancient clocks show us that from the very beginning, time has never been neutral. It has always been power written in the stars and enforced on the earth. By the time Julius Caesar rose to power, Rome was not only an empire of armies and roads, but also an empire drowning in confusion about time. The Roman calendar, still tied loosely to the moon, had been twisted and bent so badly by politics that it no longer matched the seasons. Festivals meant to honor the spring harvest were falling in the cold months of winter. Soldiers marched to war during what should have been planting season. The priests who controlled the calendar could add or remove days whenever it suited their allies, which meant time itself became a weapon of politics. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, Rome was living 3 months out of step with the natural world. Caesar decided that if he could conquer nations, he could also conquer time. In the year 45 before Christ, Caesar introduced what would be called the Julian calendar. Guided by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, he cut through the chaos of drifting days and declared that the year would no longer follow the unreliable moon, it would follow the sun. The new year would have 365 days divided into 12 months, and to make up for the extra quarter of a day that the Earth actually takes to circle the sun, he ordered that every fourth year would carry an extra day. Thus was born the leap year. For the first time, Rome had a calendar that promised order, stability, and control. But nothing Caesar touched was ever simple. To reset the drift, he added 90 days to the year 46 before Christ, creating what historians later called the Year of Confusion. Imagine living through a year so long it stretched to 445 days. Farmers were bewildered, priests scrambled to keep up with rituals, and ordinary people simply followed orders because who could argue with Caesar? When the dust settled, Rome now lived in a new flow of time, one that seemed far more precise than anything before. At first, the Julian calendar looked like a triumph. The seasons aligned once more with the festivals. Farmers could predict harvests. Armies could plan campaigns. For centuries, it was used across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East as the backbone of empire. But beneath its polished surface lay a tiny flaw, the kind of flaw that grows monstrous with time. The solar year is not exactly 365.25 days. It is slightly shorter, closer to 365.242. That difference of 11 minutes each year might seem laughably small, but across centuries it began to build. The Julian calendar was drifting again, not as fast as before, but still out of step with the sun. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the calendar was already 10 days ahead of the natural year. The spring equinox, which should have arrived on March 21st, was falling closer to March 11th. For the Church, which depended on the equinox to set the date of Easter, this was more than a mathematical error. It was a crisis of faith. If Easter was celebrated on the wrong day, did that mean Christians were disobeying God himself? The flaw hidden in Caesar's calendar would become the seed of one of the greatest interventions in history, a reform that centuries later would erase days from existence and place time itself into the hands of the Vatican. Julius Caesar thought he had mastered time. He believed he had tamed the chaos of days and seasons with a single stroke of reform. In truth, he had only delayed the storm. The Julian calendar was not the end of confusion. It was only the beginning of a deeper mystery, one that would echo across more than 1,000 years until another ruler, cloaked not in armor but in robes, decided to once again rewrite the rhythm of the world. At first, the Julian calendar seemed flawless, a masterpiece of order compared to the chaos of the old Roman system. Festivals lined up once again with the seasons. Farmers trusted that the spring equinox would guide their planting, and priests believed that Easter would always fall in its rightful place. But hidden in the numbers was a quiet mistake. The true solar year, the exact time it takes for Earth to complete its journey around the sun, is not 365.25 days. It is a little less, 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes, and a few seconds. That tiny difference of 11 minutes a year may seem harmless, but time has a way of punishing even the smallest errors. 1 year passes and the calendar is only 11 minutes ahead. A century passes and the calendar is now nearly a full day out of step with the sun. By the time 1,000 years roll by, the gap has stretched to more than a week. People still thought they were celebrating spring on March 21st, but the sun told a different story. The equinox had already slipped earlier and earlier into the month. By the Middle Ages, the calendar was 10 whole days wrong. Festivals tied to the heavens no longer matched the sky above. Imagine being a priest in the 12th century, tasked with calculating the date of Easter. Easter was supposed to be fixed to the Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. But which equinox? The one in the sky or the one on the page? When the calendar said March 21st, the sun was already standing equal on March 11th. The holiest celebration of the Christian world had drifted away from the very stars it was meant to follow. For an institution that built its authority on cosmic truth, this was a dangerous embarrassment. Farmers felt the drift too. Crops sown by the old dates no longer flourished the way they should. Seasons felt strange, harvests grew uncertain, and whispers began that the heavens themselves were shifting. In reality, it was not the sky that was broken, it was the calendar. The Julian system was not keeping faith with the cosmos. Humanity had once again lost its grip on time. The drift did more than confuse dates. It exposed a deeper problem. If time could slip, then who had the authority to fix it? Was time in the hands of nature, or in the hands of rulers and priests? The answer to that question would shape the centuries to come. By the 14th century, scholars and astronomers began raising alarms. The calendar was broken. The stars and the sun disagreed with the days marked on parchment. But reforming time was no simple matter. To admit the error was to admit that centuries of rituals, prayers, and even entire histories were tied to the wrong clock. The drift of days was not just a mistake of numbers. It was a slow-motion crisis. Every year, every festival, every equinox that passed out of alignment made it clearer that human time was separating from cosmic time. And sooner or later, someone would have to make a choice to ignore the heavens or to rewrite the calendar once again, a choice that would place time itself in the hands of the Vatican. From the very beginning, the Church understood that festivals were not just moments of worship, but anchors of power. People's lives moved with the seasons and the cycles of the sky. To control those cycles was to control the rhythm of the year itself. This is why the Church tied its holiest celebrations not to random dates, but to the movement of the sun and the moon. At the center of all of it stood Easter. Easter was not chosen as a fixed day like Christmas. It was tied instead to the spring equinox and the first full moon that followed. This meant it would always land in that mysterious window when day and night were equal and when life on earth seemed to awaken again after the darkness of winter. For Christians, it symbolized the resurrection, the triumph of life over death. For the Church, it was more than symbolic, it was practical. By making Easter depend on the heavens, the Church connected its authority to cosmic order. If you wanted to know when the holiest day would fall, you had to ask them. In the early centuries, this decision also carried another purpose. It separated Christianity from Judaism. The Jewish Passover was based on a lunar calendar, and early Christians often celebrated the resurrection at the same time. But the Church wanted its own identity. By fixing Easter to the Sunday after the first full moon following the equinox, they created a distinct system that could not be celebrated without the Church's calculations. The Council of Nicaea, in the year 325, sealed this decision. Easter would always be tied to the heavens, but only the bishops and priests would declare the date. For ordinary people, the calendar was more than a list of dates. It was a cycle of fasting, feasting, and remembering. Lent counted 40 days of sacrifice leading up to Easter. Pentecost followed after. Saints' days filled the months between. Every celebration was placed carefully on the calendar, like stones in a foundation. When people lived by these cycles, they were not just honoring God, they were following a system designed to bind their lives to the authority of the Church. But there was a hidden risk in tying festivals to the heavens. If the calendar drifted away from the real equinox, the illusion of perfect order would begin to crumble. When Easter fell further and further from the spring equinox, it was no longer aligned with the very sign it was supposed to follow. The faithful might not notice at first, but scholars did, and priests whispered that the foundation of the sacred calendar was slipping. To admit that mistake was to admit that the Church had lost control of its own clock. The sacred calendar was never only about worship. It was about weaving faith into the fabric of time so tightly that no one could separate the two. By binding festivals to celestial cycles, the Church claimed the role of timekeeper for all of Europe. Every fast, every feast, every holy day became proof that the Church was not just guiding souls, but guiding the very rhythm of existence. And when that rhythm began to falter, the stage was set for one of the greatest manipulations of time in human history. By the Middle Ages, the flaw in the Julian calendar was no longer a hidden detail whispered among astronomers. It was a crack spreading across the very foundation of Christian time. The spring equinox, which should have fallen on March 21st, was arriving earlier and earlier. By the 14th century, it was already on March 11th. That 10-day drift may seem small, but for the Church it was a disaster waiting to happen. Easter, the holiest celebration in Christendom, was supposed to be tied to the natural balance of the heavens. When that balance no longer matched the calendar, it made the entire sacred system look unstable. Imagine a priest in France standing before a congregation, declaring the date of Easter with authority. Yet when farmers looked to the skies, the signs did not match. The moon was full at the wrong time. The sun was marking the equinox on a different day. The faithful trusted the Church to be the keeper of divine order, but the heavens were quietly proving them wrong. For a religion that claimed to hold absolute truth, even a slippage of days was dangerous. Doubt spreads not when people are told lies, but when nature itself shows a contradiction. The problem stretched beyond religion. Agriculture depended on the rhythm of the seasons. Planting and harvesting followed cycles that were tied to the sun. As the dates slipped, confusion grew. Some farmers followed the calendar, others trusted the sky. Wars and famines already made life uncertain. Now, even time could not be trusted. Kings and scholars turned to Rome, asking how such an important tool of civilization could have been allowed to break. Inside the Church, debates grew louder. Some argued that the error was small, that God would forgive a few misplaced days. Others warned that every year made the problem worse. By the 15th century, the drift was so obvious that scholars from across Europe began calling for reform. Astronomers in Italy, Spain, and even distant Poland studied the stars and confirmed the truth. The calendar was broken, and if the calendar was broken, then Easter was no longer celebrated at the right time. That single fact threatened to unravel the credibility of the Vatican itself. The crisis was not only mathematical, it was spiritual. How could the Church claim to be the guide of souls if it could not even guide the seasons? How could it proclaim divine authority if it had lost track of the most sacred day? For centuries, the Church had declared itself the guardian of truth, the one institution that stood between humanity and chaos. Now chaos was seeping in, not with war or rebellion, but with days that no longer aligned with the sky. This was the calendar crisis, a silent yet explosive problem that spread across Europe. It was not fought with swords or fire, but with numbers, dates, and the quiet march of the stars. Every year that passed made the Vatican's authority look weaker. Something had to be done. Time itself would need to be rewritten. And the power to rewrite time could belong to no one but the Church. When the calendar began to drift and the crisis grew impossible to ignore, the Church faced a choice that went beyond Easter or equinoxes. It was forced to confront a deeper question, one that reached into the very heart of power. Who owns time? Was time a gift of nature, written in the stars? Or was it a tool to be managed, reshaped, and handed down by human authority? For centuries, ordinary people had followed the seasons instinctively, planting when the ground thawed, harvesting when the sun dipped lower. But the Church had bound those natural cycles to rituals, fasts, and festivals. And soon, people no longer looked only to the sky, they looked to priests. If the Church declared Easter to fall on one date, the people obeyed, even if the heavens told a different story. In that moment, the Church discovered something extraordinary. It was not just guiding faith, it was shaping memory. Time became a form of law. The weeks were filled with holy days, the months marked with saints, the year divided by Lent, Easter, Pentecost, Advent, and Christmas. Life itself was ordered not by the turning of the earth, but by the turning of the sacred calendar. To be born meant to be baptized on a date chosen by the church. To marry meant choosing a day approved by priests. To die meant being buried under dates they defined. Time was no longer neutral. It became a system of obedience, and that obedience reached into every household, every village, every kingdom. But the church soon realized that calendars did more than control the present. They shaped the past. By fixing festivals to specific dates, the Vatican decided how history itself would be remembered. Anniversaries of battles, the reigns of kings, the deaths of martyrs, all were woven into the fabric of the Christian year. A victory celebrated each year became eternal. A defeat that was never written down simply faded into silence. When the church kept the records, copied the manuscripts, and declared the holy days, it was not only preserving memory, it was choosing which memories would survive. This realization gave the Vatican something even more powerful than armies or crowns. It meant they could bend time to their will. A pope could erase a day, extend a year, or move an equinox, and the entire continent would adjust without question. If time itself could be rewritten by decree, then history could be reshaped at the same moment. When you think of kings ruling with swords, imagine instead the church ruling with calendars. No blood spilled, yet every life bound. By the late Middle Ages, it became clear that the question was no longer whether Easter was drifting. The question was, who had the authority to decide when spring began, when the year turned, and when the future would arrive? The church already knew the answer. Time belonged not to the stars, not to farmers, not to kings. It belonged to those who declared it, and once the Vatican stepped into that role, it ceased to be only a spiritual guide. It became the master of memory itself. In the autumn of the year 1582, the world went to sleep on Thursday, October 4th, and woke up the next morning on Friday, October 15th. 10 whole days had vanished, erased with a stroke of papal authority. They were not destroyed by war, not lost in disaster, not swallowed by some cosmic event. They were deleted by decree. Pope Gregory XIII had ordered the correction of the Julian calendar, and overnight, entire lifetimes of memories, birthdays, contracts, and anniversaries were stripped from the record. Time itself had been rewritten. For the ordinary people of Europe, this was terrifying. Imagine being a farmer who carefully tracked the days of harvest, only to be told that a week and a half of your life never existed. Imagine being a merchant whose debts were suddenly due sooner because the calendar had leapt ahead. Families who had planned weddings or festivals for October 6th found that their chosen dates had vanished. To them, it felt as if the church had stolen time from their very hands. But to the Vatican, this was not theft. It was salvation. The equinox had drifted too far. Easter was falling dangerously out of alignment with the heavens, and the credibility of the church was at risk. Removing days was the only solution. Across Europe, reactions were mixed. Catholic nations like Italy, Spain, and Portugal obeyed immediately. Their people grumbled but complied, knowing resistance against papal command was useless. But Protestant lands refused. To them, the new calendar was a Catholic trick. They clung to the old Julian dates, which meant that for centuries neighbours lived by different times. A Catholic might be celebrating Christmas, while a Protestant neighbour was still waiting for December to arrive. Wars already divided Europe, and now even time itself was split. The sudden jump forward also stirred deeper fears. In villages, whispers spread that the lost days had been taken by the devil. Some believed their lives had been shortened. Others thought they had been cheated out of wages or rents. Angry crowds protested in the streets, demanding their days back. The phrase, "Give us back our 11 days," would later echo in England when they too adopted the change in the year 1752. For the people, time was not an abstract calculation. It was their daily bread, their prayers, their sense of existence. To see it vanish in an instant was a wound that did not easily heal. Yet behind the anger and confusion was something even more unsettling. The event revealed how fragile time truly was. If 10 days could be removed by command, what else could be rewritten? Could years be added, centuries erased, histories rearranged? If the Church could shift the calendar with a pen, then memory itself was not safe. Time, which people thought was eternal and untouchable, had been exposed as something malleable, something in the hands of men. The 10 lost days were more than a correction of mathematics. They were a demonstration of power, a reminder that the Vatican could reach into the most intimate part of human life and alter it without permission. When Thursday the 4th was followed not by Friday the 5th, but by Friday the 15th, the world was shown that the clock of civilization was not set by the stars, but by those who claimed the authority to keep it. And in that moment, humanity stepped into a new reality, one where even time itself could be stolen. When the calendar leapt forward in October of 1582, ordinary people were left in shock. They had gone to bed on Thursday, October 4th, expecting to rise the next morning to Friday, October 5th. Instead, they awoke to Friday, October 15th. 10 days were gone, erased without warning. For rulers, scholars, and priests, this was a matter of mathematics. For the people, it was personal. It was their birthdays, their deaths, their harvests, their very lives that had been stolen. In cities, markets opened on what should have been the 5th, but the date written on signs and documents said the 15th. Rent that was due on the 10th was suddenly demanded at once because the 10th no longer existed. Merchants scrambled to adjust contracts. Workers worried that their wages would be cut short. Families who had planned weddings or funerals during those missing days found themselves caught in confusion. Priests tried to reassure them, explaining that the days had not truly vanished, only corrected. But to those living through it, the reassurance felt hollow. The nights had passed, the sun had risen, and the Church declared those days did not count. In the countryside, the reaction was even stronger. Farmers lived by the rhythm of nature, not parchment. They had seen the stars, tracked the moon, watched the fields ripen. To them, no one could tell them that 10 days had disappeared. The wheat still needed harvesting. The cows still needed milking. Time was lived, not decreed. Whispers spread through villages that the Church had stolen part of their lives. Some muttered that their lifespans had been shortened, that death would now come 10 days sooner. Others believed something darker, that the days had been taken as a bargain with the devil. There were protests, though not always loud. Some townspeople shouted in the streets demanding their days back. In later centuries, the memory of this discontent would echo in England, where mobs famously cried, "Give us back our 11 days," when the reform finally reached them in the year 1752. But in Catholic lands of 1582, rebellion against papal authority was dangerous. Most grumbled quietly, obeying outwardly while resenting inwardly. They adjusted because they had no choice. The silence of the people was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of power pressing down on voices too small to resist. They did not riot in the way kings feared, but their distrust lingered. The event planted a seed of unease that would grow over generations. If the Church could erase 10 days, what else could it erase? Could history itself be rewritten? Could centuries vanish just as easily as those missing nights? For ordinary citizens, the calendar reform was more than a technical correction. It was proof that time was not sacred. It was fragile. And so, people carried on, working their fields, opening their shops, attending their masses, but deep inside, they knew something had changed. The trust that the calendar was a mirror of nature was gone. Time no longer belonged to the sky, it belonged to authority. And in the quiet acceptance of those stolen days, a greater silence was born. The silence of people who had learned that even their hours could be taken from them, and there was nothing they could do. Behind the sweeping decision to erase 10 days from the calendar in 1582, there was not only Pope Gregory XIII, but a circle of minds who worked in shadows, the Jesuit mathematicians. These men were not kings, not warriors, and not the kind of figures whose names filled the chronicles of history. They were astronomers and clerics, men of numbers and faith, hidden away in private chambers, calculating the fate of centuries. While the public believed the reform was a sudden papal decree, the truth is that it was the result of decades of secret study carried out by this team. At the heart of their work was a simple but urgent problem. The Julian calendar had slipped 10 days away from the true solar year. Every spring, the equinox fell earlier than the calendar claimed. Easter, the holiest day of Christianity, was drifting further from the heavens it was tied to. To the Vatican, this was not only embarrassing but dangerous. Their authority rested on being keepers of truth. If the calendar no longer matched the sky, then the Church's claim to cosmic order was unraveling. Fixing this problem could not be left to chance or to open debate. It had to be handled in silence. The Jesuit mathematicians worked in private chambers inside Rome, poring over ancient records, comparing the observations of Greeks, Arabs, and modern astronomers. They studied eclipses recorded in China, calculations made in Islamic observatories, and star charts from the libraries of Europe. They cross-checked centuries of celestial data and then moulded it into a system that would serve not the stars but the Church. To them, astronomy was not simply science, it was a tool of obedience. By controlling the calendar, they could align heaven with doctrine and doctrine with power. One of the leading figures was the Jesuit scholar Christopher Clavius, often called the architect of the Gregorian calendar. Clavius and his colleagues worked with astonishing precision for their time. They decided that leap years should not occur every 4 years without exception, but would be skipped in 3 out of every 4 centuries. This tiny adjustment slowed the drift, so that the calendar would remain aligned with the solar year for thousands of years. The brilliance of the system was undeniable, but the brilliance was hidden beneath robes and shadows. The names of those who laboured on it were not shouted in the streets. They were kept quiet, as if the calendar itself had been born from the divine will of the Pope alone. For the Jesuits, secrecy was not unusual. Their order had long been accused of being the intellectual arm of the Vatican, infiltrating courts and kingdoms with minds sharper than swords. In the calendar reform, their reputation was confirmed. They proved that numbers could be more powerful than armies, and that mathematics in the hands of the faithful could reshape reality itself. So when October jumped from the 4th to the 15th, the world saw the Pope's authority. But behind the throne, in candlelit rooms filled with parchment and calculations, it was the Jesuit mathematicians who had written the future. They were the hidden keepers of time, the quiet engineers of the modern world's clock, and they left behind a truth more unsettling than any decree. Time is not natural, it is designed. And the designers were not the stars, but men who chose to serve both faith and power. When the Gregorian calendar was unveiled in 1582, it was presented as the perfect solution to centuries of drift. To the public, it seemed like a triumph of reason guided by faith. But not every astronomer agreed. Beneath the surface, debates raged. Some insisted the changes were clever but incomplete. Others warned that the Vatican was not fixing time but bending it to its own needs. Yet, few of these voices survived in the official record. Those who questioned too loudly were silenced, and their names faded into obscurity. Astronomy had always been a dangerous profession when it brushed against power. Watching the skies was harmless until the moment those observations contradicted doctrine. For centuries, scholars in the Islamic world had tracked stars with accuracy unmatched in Europe. They noticed inconsistencies that the Julian calendar failed to explain. In China, eclipse records stretched back thousands of years, offering a cosmic record that exposed gaps in the European timeline. Independent European astronomers also raised alarms, pointing out that no calendar devised by men could truly capture the movements of heaven without adjustment. But these voices often reached dead ends. The Vatican had invested its authority in the new calendar, and authority does not tolerate cracks. The Jesuits who designed the reform defended it with fervour, dismissing critics as misguided. Astronomers who resisted often found themselves without patrons, without funding, or worse, accused of heresy. The memory of earlier thinkers like Roger Bacon, who had been imprisoned for challenging doctrine, still haunted the scholarly world. Every astronomer knew that questioning the Church's calendar meant questioning the Church itself, and that was a line few dared to cross. Still, fragments of dissent remain. Some records show scholars in Protestant lands mocking the reform, calling it a Catholic trick to manipulate holy days. Others suggested that the so-called correction was simply another layer of distortion, aligning the calendar not with the stars, but with papal power. They asked dangerous questions. If the Pope could erase 10 days, what stopped him from erasing years? If time could be adjusted once, how many times had it already been altered? These were questions no one in Rome wanted, whispered aloud. The most telling sign of how dangerous this debate was can be seen in what is missing. In the centuries that followed, few names of outspoken critics survived. Their work was not copied, their manuscripts not preserved. Silence swallowed them. Meanwhile, the voices that supported the reform were amplified, celebrated, and written into official history. To later generations, it seemed as though the entire scholarly world had agreed. In truth, the agreement was crafted not by consensus, but by control. Astronomy is supposed to be the science that cannot lie, the study of stars and planets that move without care for human politics. Yet, even the stars can be silenced if their interpreters are silenced. When dissenters vanished from records, the heavens themselves seemed to bow to papal authority. The battle between astronomy and authority was not fought in the sky, but in libraries, courts, and whispered accusations. And in that battle, the Vatican ensured that time would follow its script, even if the stars told a different story. When Pope Gregory XIII revealed his new calendar in 1582, Catholic nations obeyed almost immediately. Spain, Portugal, and Italy all jumped forward 10 days without question. But in the lands of the Reformation, the reaction was very different. Protestant countries saw the Gregorian calendar not as a scientific correction, but as a Catholic weapon. To them, accepting the Pope's new way of counting days meant accepting papal authority, and that was something they had broken away from at great cost. Time itself became a battlefield of faith. In England, where Henry VIII had torn the crown from Rome decades earlier, suspicion ran deep. The idea that the Pope could decide when Easter would be celebrated, when Christmas would fall, or which days would vanish from the year, was intolerable. Leaders warned their people that adopting the new calendar would mean surrendering to Rome's influence once again. So they clung stubbornly to the old Julian system, even as the equinox slipped further out of place. In Germany, the divide was sharper still. Catholic regions accepted the reform, but Lutheran states resisted, creating a strange situation where neighbours marked different days, celebrated holidays weeks apart, and lived by competing versions of time. For ordinary people, this created endless confusion. Merchants, travelling from Catholic France to Protestant England, had to juggle two calendars. Letters crossed borders and arrived stamped with dates that seemed impossible. Diplomats struggled to agree on meeting times. Even wars became harder to track, as battles were recorded on different dates depending on who kept the chronicle. It was as if Europe had fractured not only in politics and religion, but in time itself. Protestant leaders did not only reject the reform out of pride, they also distrusted the Vatican's hidden motives. If Rome could erase 10 days, what else could it erase? What if entire centuries had been shifted to serve prophecy or papal authority? The Reformation had already taught Protestants to be suspicious of Catholic control over Scripture. Now, they extended that suspicion to the calendar. For them, the Gregorian system was not the restoration of truth, but the rewriting of truth. Better to live by a drifting calendar than to surrender their independence to the Pope. This resistance lasted for centuries. England did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until the year 1752, and even then, the people erupted in protest, shouting, "Give us back our 11 days." Russia refused until after its revolution in 1918. Each delay carried the same undertone of defiance. To reject the Pope's calendar was to reject his power. To accept it was to admit that Rome could still rule the very rhythm of life. The Protestant rejection of the Gregorian calendar shows how deeply time itself had become a tool of authority. It was no longer only about measuring the sun or the stars. It was about allegiance, obedience, and identity. By refusing the Catholic calendar, Protestant nations carved their own path, but they also fractured Europe further. For centuries, a merchant could leave home in one year and arrive in another, crossing not only borders, but different versions of history. Time itself had become divided, a symbol of a continent at war with its own memory. In the year 1752, England woke to find that the calendar had betrayed them. For generations, the English had resisted the Pope's reform, clinging to the Julian calendar long after Catholic nations had leapt forward into the Gregorian system. But as trade expanded and diplomacy became tangled in the confusion of mismatched dates, the government finally gave in. An Act of Parliament declared that September 2nd would be followed not by September 3rd, but by September 14th. 11 days would vanish overnight. The change was made in silence on paper, but the people did not take it silently. Imagine being a labourer in London who worked each day for wages owed weekly. Suddenly, nearly 2 weeks were missing from the year. Rent was still due. Debts were still collected. But workers felt cheated out of pay, and farmers felt robbed of days from their lives. Crowds gathered in the streets shouting, "Give us back our 11 days." Anger boiled over into riots. In some towns, effigies of politicians were burned. In others, mobs stormed public squares demanding that Parliament return the stolen time. To the government, the reform was simple mathematics. To the people, it was theft of life itself. The unrest revealed something deeper than outrage over wages. Time for ordinary citizens was not abstract, it was personal. A child's birthday planned for September 5th was erased. A funeral date, carefully chosen, vanished into nothing. Contracts written for mid-September suddenly became confusing riddles. Families felt as if their very memories were being torn from the fabric of reality. No decree could convince them that these days had never mattered. They had lived them in their minds even if the state insisted they no longer existed. The chaos was worsened by religious suspicion. Many English Protestants still distrusted the Gregorian calendar, seeing it as a Catholic trick smuggled into their lives by politicians eager to please Europe. Priests tried to calm congregations, insisting that no years had been shortened, that no one would die younger because of the change. But the whispers in taverns and market stalls said otherwise. Some claimed their lives had been cut short by 11 days. Others believed the lost time was a dark omen, proof that the end of the world was near. The riots eventually cooled, but the scars of that moment lingered. England had been forced into the modern world, but at the cost of trust. People realized that time was not sacred, not natural, not fixed to the stars. It was something that could be erased or redrawn by lawmakers sitting in distant halls. The Gregorian calendar became the law of the land, but it never fully lost the shadow of suspicion. Even centuries later, the phrase, "Give us back our 11 days," remained a bitter echo of the uproar. What happened in 1752 was more than a correction of dates. It was a revelation of power. When a government could reach into the most intimate part of human existence and declare that 11 days had never happened, it proved that history and memory could be rewritten. England did not just lose days. It lost the illusion that time was untouchable, and from that year onward, the clock of the nation ticked not by the stars, but by decree. When the Gregorian calendar spread beyond Europe, it did not travel as a simple tool of science. It moved as a weapon of empire. Every ship that left the harbours of Spain or Portugal in the 16th century carried more than soldiers and traders. They carried time itself, written in papal decrees and bound to the authority of the Church. Wherever the cross was planted, the new calendar soon followed. Colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia were not only forced to change their language and their faith, but also the way they measured days. Timekeeping became part of conquest. For missionaries, the calendar was essential. To baptize new converts meant setting feast days, marking Lent, celebrating Easter, and counting holy time according to Rome. The Gregorian calendar was a way to erase local traditions and replace them with Christian cycles. Ancient festivals tied to harvests or lunar events were condemned as pagan and absorbed into saints' days. Villages that once celebrated their new year with the stars of their ancestors were taught to mark January 1st as the only beginning. Time itself was remade in the image of the colonizer. The calendar also served empire in practical ways. Armies and fleets needed synchronization. Trade demanded contracts written on dates that matched across continents. A Spanish merchant in Mexico could not afford to live by one system of days, while his partner in Seville lived by another. The Gregorian calendar provided unity, but it was a unity built on domination. Local systems of time were ridiculed, suppressed, or outlawed. To reject the papal calendar was to reject the empire itself, and such defiance rarely went unpunished. The link between calendar and empire was so strong that adopting the Gregorian system became a sign of allegiance. Catholic colonies were expected to follow Rome's clock. Protestant colonies hesitated, but eventually followed, not for faith, but for survival in global trade. Even faraway kingdoms in Asia felt the pressure. Japan, after centuries of resistance, finally adopted the Gregorian calendar in the 19th century to show the Western world that it was modern. In doing so, it was not simply adopting dates, it was stepping into a world order shaped by Europe. The deeper consequence was psychological. When people lost their old calendars, they lost part of their identity. The rhythms of planting, worship, and storytelling that had guided their ancestors were erased. History itself was rewritten as if it had always followed the Gregorian system. Children born under empire grew up believing that time had always been counted in this way. They never knew that their ancestors once lived by different stars and different cycles. The Gregorian calendar was not only a correction of mathematics, it was a banner of power. Wherever it spread, it announced that Rome and later the empires of Europe controlled not just land and souls, but the very flow of existence. The conquest of time was the silent conquest, one that outlived wars, revolutions, and empires themselves. And in every clock that ticks today, in every calendar pinned to a wall, the shadow of that conquest still lingers, reminding us that time itself was once taken as a tool of empire. The official reason for the Gregorian reform was simple. Easter was drifting. The spring equinox no longer fell on March 21st, as it had in the time of the Council of Nicaea, and that meant the holiest day of Christianity was slowly moving away from the heavens it was tied to. The Vatican declared that the reform was a necessary correction to preserve the sacred order of faith. But was that the whole truth? Or was Easter only the excuse for something far deeper? Easter had always been more than a holiday. It was the centerpiece of the Christian year, the anchor from which all other feasts and fasts were calculated. If Easter slipped, then Lent, Pentecost, and countless saints' days slipped with it. The entire rhythm of Christian life threatened to unravel. By claiming to fix Easter, the Church was really securing its control over every moment of the calendar. No one could question the correction because no one dared to question the resurrection. Easter was the perfect shield. But historians and skeptics have long asked if the reform was really about mathematics and devotion or about power. Consider this. By the 16th century, Europe was divided by the Reformation. Protestant nations rejected papal authority, Catholic nations clung to it, and the calendar crisis was tearing credibility away from Rome. If the Pope could step forward and declare himself the guardian of time itself, it was more than a correction. It was a show of dominance. The message was clear. Only the Vatican could align earth with heaven. Only the Pope could dictate when the holiest day would fall. There was also the matter of empire. By tying the reform to Easter, the Vatican ensured that the new calendar could be exported with the faith. Missionaries could carry it to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, and claim it was not merely a tool of politics, but a necessity of salvation. To celebrate Easter on the wrong day was heresy. To adopt the new system was obedience. Behind the language of devotion lay the machinery of expansion. The secrecy of the reform process also hints that Easter may have been a pretext. Jesuit mathematicians worked behind closed doors, consulting data from Islamic and ancient sources, drawing on the wisdom of civilizations that the Church otherwise condemned as pagan or infidel. Why such secrecy if the reform was purely about faith? Why silence critics if truth was on their side? Perhaps because the calendar was not only about Easter, but about securing intellectual control over history itself. If time could be edited in the name of faith, then any part of the timeline could be reshaped when convenient. So was the Gregorian reform truly about Easter? Yes, but not in the way it was explained to the people. Easter was the visible reason, the sacred banner under which the reform marched. Beneath it lay a deeper motive, the consolidation of power. By correcting the date of resurrection, the Vatican was resurrecting its own authority, reminding the world that even the stars and seasons must bow to Rome. Easter was the key, but the lock it opened was far greater, the lock to the control of time itself. The official story of the Gregorian reform tells us it was about correcting the drift of Easter, about bringing the equinox back to March 21st, and keeping the sacred calendar in harmony with the heavens. But beneath this explanation lurks a more unsettling possibility, one whispered by historians and skeptics for centuries. What if the reform was not only about science or devotion, but about prophecy? What if the Vatican shifted dates not to correct mistakes, but to shape the timeline in ways that made biblical predictions appear to come true? From the earliest days of Christianity, prophecy had been one of the Church's most powerful tools. The Book of Daniel, the visions of Revelation, the idea of a 1,000-year reign, all fed into a vision of history that was supposed to unfold according to divine design. But what if real events failed to match the timeline of Scripture? What if history was moving in ways that did not fit the prophecy? The temptation to bend time so that reality matched expectation would have been immense. By adjusting the calendar, even by a handful of days, the Church could align the unfolding of history with the sacred script. Wars, coronations, plagues, even the rise of empires could be interpreted as the fulfillment of prophecy simply because the timeline had been nudged into place. Some scholars suggest that this was exactly what happened in 1582. The 10 lost days were not just a correction of mathematics, but a realignment of time itself to restore prophecy's authority. When Easter once again fell where it had in the 4th century, it was not only about astronomy, it was about creating the illusion that prophecy was unfolding as it should. In this sense, the Church was not only keeping time, it was keeping the future. The idea becomes even more chilling when you consider how calendars shape collective memory. If people believe a prophecy was fulfilled in a certain year, they rarely question whether the year itself has been shifted. A date printed in a chronicle or inscribed in a church record becomes truth. Once the Gregorian system was adopted, all previous records were reinterpreted through it. Ancient events suddenly matched prophecies more neatly than before. History itself bent towards Scripture because the Church had adjusted the ruler by which history was measured. Critics who dared to raise these suspicions were dismissed as heretics or conspiracy theorists of their own age. But the silence that surrounded them raises its own questions. If the reform was purely about Easter, why so much secrecy? Why the suppression of dissent? Why the erasure of critical voices from the archives? Perhaps because the calendar was never meant to be a neutral tool. It was meant to be a stage, and prophecy was the performance acted upon it. Aligning time with prophecy gave the church something beyond power over festivals or farming. It gave them authority over destiny itself. If prophecy seemed fulfilled, then faith was strengthened. If faith was strengthened, obedience followed. By shifting dates to match Scripture, the Vatican ensured that the hand of God appeared visible in history, even if it was human hands quietly turning the clock. The power to predict has always been the power to rule. In ancient times, priests watched the stars to announce eclipses, floods, and harvests, and the people believed they were hearing the voice of the gods. By the time of the Gregorian Reform, the Vatican had inherited this role, but on a scale far greater than any temple of the past. By controlling the calendar, it could decide when holidays would fall, when jubilees would be proclaimed, and even when entire populations would prepare for the end of the world. Time itself became a prophecy machine, with the Church as its operator. Take jubilees, for example. These were special years of forgiveness and renewal declared by the Pope, when debts could be absolved and sins wiped clean. The faithful would travel to Rome by the thousands, filling its churches with offerings. But jubilees did not happen naturally. They were set by the calendar, and the calendar was in the Vatican's hands. A pope could decide that a new jubilee was due earlier than expected, or extend the time before the next one. What seemed like divine rhythm was in fact papal strategy. By moving dates, the Vatican could trigger waves of devotion and wealth whenever it needed them most. The same was true of holidays. Christmas was fixed, but Easter floated with the moon and the equinox. Saints' days were scattered throughout the year. Each one was an opportunity for gathering, fasting, feasting, and offerings. By adjusting the calendar, even subtly, the Church controlled the heartbeat of society. Farmers planted according to feast days. Merchants scheduled markets around festivals. Kings planned wars and treaties around holy observances. If the Vatican declared that time had shifted, the entire continent shifted with it. Even more unsettling was the Church's influence over apocalyptic expectation. The Bible spoke of a 1,000-year reign, of signs in the heavens, of dates that pointed to the end of days. Throughout the Middle Ages, ordinary people looked anxiously to the calendar for proof that prophecy was coming true. When a plague struck or a comet appeared, they counted the years to see if the final trumpet was near. By setting the calendar, the Vatican could either calm these fears or intensify them. If the Church declared that a certain year marked the Millennium since Christ, people braced for judgment. If it said the year was not yet reached, the people relaxed. With nothing more than a stroke of calculation, the Vatican could control the very sense of destiny. This was more than astronomy. It was the shaping of belief through time. The ability to say not only what day it was, but what that day meant. For the faithful, a festival was not just a date on paper. It was a sign of eternity, a reminder that history was unfolding according to divine design. And because the Vatican alone could declare when those signs appeared, it held the keys not only to the past and the present, but to the future. Power in prediction was the most subtle form of control, because it required no armies, no battles, and no chains. Only a calendar and the authority to declare which days would bring salvation, and which would bring the end. The Gregorian calendar was introduced in 1582 as a correction, a way to realign Easter with the heavens and erase the drift of the Julian system. But some scholars and skeptics whisper a darker theory. What if the reform was not only about fixing time, but rewriting it? What if centuries themselves were quietly removed or invented to synchronize prophecy with power? This idea is known as the phantom time hypothesis, and though dismissed by mainstream historians, it lingers like a shadow over the calendar we use today. According to the hypothesis, nearly 300 years of the early Middle Ages never happened. Events between the years 600 and 900 were fabricated, inserted into the timeline to serve political and religious purposes. Some historians point to the strange silence of that era, a time with few reliable records, missing chronicles, and kings who seem to echo the deeds of rulers from earlier centuries. They ask why Charlemagne, supposedly a giant of European history, appears to mirror Constantine the Great in eerie detail, almost as if one was a copy of the other. If these centuries were manufactured, then the Gregorian reform was not simply correcting drift, it was locking in a manipulated history. Why would anyone erase or invent centuries? The answer lies in prophecy. The Bible spoke of specific timelines, of millennia and reigns that pointed to the destiny of humanity. If real history did not match those timelines, the Church risked losing its claim to divine authority. By stretching or compressing history, by inserting phantom years, prophecy could be made to fit neatly into the present. When Pope Gregory XIII declared the new calendar, it did not only fix Easter, it anchored a version of history that served the Vatican's role as the keeper of destiny. Evidence for this theory is strange but unsettling. Astronomical events like eclipses recorded in other civilizations do not always align with European records of the same period. Architecture and artifacts, supposedly dated to the phantom centuries, are suspiciously scarce. Even papal lists contain names of popes whose existence is uncertain, with no independent confirmation outside of Vatican documents. To those who believe the hypothesis, the missing centuries are not an accident. They are a design. If this is true, then the Gregorian reform was not the simple adjustment of a clock, but the cementing of a grand illusion. By deleting or inventing centuries, the Church could present itself as the unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of Christianity. It could declare prophecy fulfilled exactly when it wanted it fulfilled. It could shape memory itself so that no one would even realize what had been lost. Whether phantom time is real or not, the question remains chilling. The reform proved that time could be edited with the stroke of a pen. If 10 days could vanish in October of 1582, why not centuries? If history can shrink, then what we call the past may not be the truth at all, but a story carefully designed to synchronize faith with power. And we may still be living inside that story without even knowing it. When historians speak of the Middle Ages, they describe nearly 1,000 years of European history, stretching from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. Yet within that long stretch lies a peculiar silence. Between the 7th and the 10th centuries, records grow scarce, events blur, and entire decades seem to pass with little to show for them. This is often called the Dark Age within the Dark Ages, a medieval blackout where memory itself seems to have been dimmed. Some argue this was simply a time of decline. Others whisper that the blackout was no accident, that shifts in the calendar itself helped erase or distort those missing centuries. The Gregorian reform in 1582 is often seen as a technical fix, but its deeper consequence was the rewriting of time. By leaping 10 days forward and recalibrating leap years, the Church not only corrected drift, but set in stone which years mattered and which did not. When the new calendar was adopted, all earlier records had to be translated into it. Documents were recopied, chronicles adjusted, feast days recalculated. In this process of conversion, centuries of European history already fragile were given new dates, or left behind altogether. What was remembered survived, but what did not fit vanished into silence. The medieval blackout is especially strange because it stands in contrast to the rest of the world. While Europe seemed to slumber, China experienced the brilliance of the Tang dynasty. The Islamic world built libraries in Baghdad and advanced medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Even distant Mesoamerican civilizations tracked time with astonishing precision. Yet Europe appears nearly blank, its kings vague, its wars uncertain, its chronicles fragmented. Was it truly asleep, or was its past deliberately dimmed when the calendar was restructured? Consider how the Church handled manuscripts. Monks copied texts, but often adjusted them to align with theological timelines. Dates that did not fit the sacred framework were rewritten. Holidays shifted to match new cycles. Saints were inserted into gaps, creating the illusion of continuity where little evidence existed. By the time the Gregorian calendar was introduced, those centuries of hazy history were already fragile. With the reform, they were locked into place, their contradictions hidden beneath the authority of papal timekeeping. Skeptics of the phantom time hypothesis argue that no centuries were erased, only forgotten. But forgetting can be as powerful as erasing. If the public never saw documents from those missing years, if their feasts no longer carried the memory of them, if schools never taught them, then those centuries effectively ceased to exist. The blackout was complete, not because history was destroyed, but because time itself was adjusted until the gaps became invisible. The medieval blackout remains one of the strangest shadows of European history. Whether caused by real decline or deliberate manipulation, it reveals how fragile memory is when tied to calendars controlled by authority. When days can be stolen, years reshaped, and centuries blurred, the past becomes less a record of truth and more a canvas painted by those who decide what time it is. And perhaps the greatest silence of all is the silence of the centuries no one remembers. In the strange world of medieval history, one figure stands at the center of the phantom time debate: Emperor Otto III. His reign at the turn of the first millennium has long been studied for its ambition and mystery, but some scholars believe it holds the key to understanding how entire centuries may have been fabricated. The theory is unsettling but simple. By altering the calendar, Otto could present himself not just as a ruler, but as the divinely appointed emperor of a prophetic age. Time itself became the throne on which he sat. Otto III was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 996, but he was not content to rule as a king among many. He dreamed of reviving the grandeur of Rome, of presenting himself as the chosen leader of a new Christian world. The problem was that prophecy mattered. Biblical writings and medieval expectations spoke of important events unfolding around the year 1000. To live and rule in that year was to be part of destiny. But what if history had not yet reached the right date? What if the millennium was still centuries away? The answer, according to some theories, was to create the date he needed. The phantom time hypothesis suggests that nearly 300 years were added to the calendar during this period, placing Otto's reign at the dawn of the second millennium, even if it was not. By shifting history forward, Otto could claim that his rule fulfilled prophecy, that he stood at the appointed moment marked by Scripture. This was more than clever politics. It was the crafting of legitimacy through time. If prophecy declared that a new order would rise in the year 1000, then Otto could become its emperor simply by making sure the year was declared to be 1000. Supporting this idea are curious details in the records of the era. The documentation of the 7th through the 9th centuries is thin, fragmented, and sometimes contradictory. Wars appear with little evidence. Kings are listed with almost no deeds. Even the architecture of the period is suspiciously scarce. Then suddenly, with Otto, the world seems to reawaken, as if history had been stretched to bring him into alignment with prophecy. Some historians point to the similarities between Otto and earlier rulers, suggesting that stories were recycled, names altered, and centuries filled in with echoes of the past to make the timeline appear unbroken. If this theory holds truth, it would mean that the Gregorian reform of 1582 did not only correct a drift, but cemented a deception first created by emperors and popes in the 10th century. Otto would not just be remembered as a ruler of men, but as a ruler of time itself, one who bent history to place himself at the center of divine destiny. The emperor's date is a chilling reminder of how fragile history can be when tied to calendars shaped by power. If a king could make himself the fulfillment of prophecy by fabricating centuries, then the story of the past is not only about what happened, it is about who decided what year it was when it happened. And perhaps Otto III was the man who proved that controlling the clock is the greatest form of rule. The sky does not lie. Stars move in patterns that can be tracked for thousands of years, and eclipses in particular are among the most predictable events in nature. Modern astronomers with advanced software can calculate exactly when and where an eclipse would have been visible centuries ago, down to the day and even the hour. This makes eclipses one of the strongest tools for verifying history. If a medieval chronicle says an eclipse darkened the sky on a certain date, astronomers can check if it truly happened. But here is where the story turns unsettling. Some eclipses recorded in European history never happened at all. When scholars cross-reference European records with astronomical calculations, strange gaps appear. Chronicles from the so-called Dark Ages describe eclipses that modern science proves could not have occurred on those dates. Even more curious are the missing eclipses, celestial events that absolutely did take place and were recorded in China or the Middle East, yet leave no trace in European accounts. It is as if whole chapters of the sky were erased from the continent's memory. This is not a small problem. It suggests that the official timeline may have been edited to fit the narrative of authority rather than the truth of the heavens. Take the period between the years 600 and 900, the very centuries suspected in the phantom time hypothesis. Astronomical records from China and the Islamic world list eclipses with precision. But when European records from the same years are examined, the data does not match. Some eclipses appear centuries off. Others are copied from earlier descriptions, with only the names of rulers changed. The sun and moon do not repeat their paths, yet history in Europe seems to recycle them as if they did. Even later, during the Middle Ages, problems continue. Certain events tied to eclipses, such as coronations or battles said to be marked by heavenly signs, do not line up with actual celestial movements. For example, a battle described as taking place under a darkened sky is revealed by modern astronomy to have happened on a perfectly clear day. Were the chroniclers mistaken, or were the dates themselves deliberately shifted to align with prophecy or papal authority? The deeper the contradictions run, the harder it is to dismiss them as simple error. The unsettling conclusion is that the calendar itself may have been adjusted to create the illusion of prophecy fulfilled, or to hide inconvenient truths about when certain events actually occurred. By rewriting the dates of eclipses, the Church could present them as signs from God, while suppressing those that did not fit the narrative. Over centuries, this selective memory created a timeline that no longer matches the sky. Eclipses that never happened remind us of the danger of trusting human records over the cosmos. The stars carry their own history, one that cannot be burned, censored, or hidden in vaults. When their testimony clashes with the official story, it raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps we are living not in the year we think we are, but in a version of history edited to fit the will of men. And if the sky itself cannot be trusted to correct us, then time has already been stolen. If European history seems to blur into silence during the so-called missing centuries, the skies tell a different story, especially when compared with the records of other civilizations. While Europe stumbled through its medieval blackout, Chinese astronomers, Islamic scholars, and Mayan priests kept meticulous notes on the heavens. They recorded eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments with such precision that modern scientists can match them against astronomical models and confirm their accuracy. Yet when these records are lined up with the European timeline preserved under the Gregorian calendar, they do not always align. The stars tell one story, Europe tells another. In China, the Tang dynasty of the 7th through 9th centuries left detailed chronicles of celestial events. Chinese astronomers observed eclipses and comets with extraordinary care, noting exact dates, times, and locations. Their records match perfectly with modern astronomical calculations. When the same events are sought in European chronicles, however, they are often missing or appear centuries off. An eclipse visible across both Asia and Europe might be recorded in Chinese annals on the correct day, but show up in a European chronicle at a completely different point in time, if it is mentioned at all. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did Europe forget, or was its calendar deliberately altered to hide the mismatch? The Islamic world provides another puzzle. From Baghdad to Damascus, observatories flourished during the very centuries Europe calls dark. Scholars like al-Battani and al-Khwarizmi refined astronomical tables that still influence science today. They recorded planetary motions and lunar cycles that can be cross-checked with modern models, and their accuracy is astonishing. Yet, when European timelines of the same period are compared, the data is warped. Some eclipses noted in the Islamic world are absent in European records, while others appear duplicated under different rulers. The heavens could not have shown different faces to different peoples, which means the problem lies not with the stars, but with the way Europe remembered them. Even the ancient Mayans, long before Columbus, tracked time with a level of sophistication that rivaled Europe's best minds. Their calendar predicted solar and lunar cycles with uncanny accuracy, stretching thousands of years into the past and future. When matched with modern calculations, their astronomical data holds true, but when it is laid beside the Gregorian framework, the neat alignment frays, it seems the Mayans kept better track of the heavens than a Europe supposedly guided by the Church's guardians of truth. The implication is unsettling. If the Chinese, Islamic and Mayan records agree with the stars, and only Europe's version stumbles, then perhaps Europe's timeline was not merely drifting, but rewritten. By the time the Gregorian reform fixed Easter and erased 10 days in 1582, centuries of manipulated memory had already been locked in place. The stars are honest, but history is not. And when civilizations across the globe preserve celestial truth, while Europe's narrative bends under contradiction, we are left with a haunting possibility. The Gregorian calendar does not reflect the sky at all. It reflects the will of those who claim the right to control time. The past can be rewritten. Documents can be burned, kings invented, and centuries shifted on parchment. But there is one witness that never forgets: the sky itself. The stars move in patterns that no pope, emperor, or council can alter. An eclipse that crossed the Earth in the year 600 will cross it again in precisely calculated intervals. A comet that streaked across the heavens will reappear on schedule centuries later. The night sky is the one record that cannot be forged, and that is why astronomy has always been the greatest threat to the Vatican's chronology. When the Gregorian calendar was created in 1582, it was not simply about correcting Easter, it was also about preserving the Church's control over history. But the stars did not bend to Rome. They revealed discrepancies. Astronomers who compared ancient records to the new calendar sometimes found gaps. Eclipses said to have occurred in European chronicles could not be confirmed by celestial mechanics. Others that should have been seen over Europe were never mentioned at all. Each missing or misplaced event chipped away at the Vatican's claim to be the keeper of truth. This is why astronomers often found themselves in dangerous positions. Men like Galileo did not only argue that the Earth moved around the Sun, they also implied that the calendar of heaven was not under the Church's authority. When Galileo was forced to recant in 1633, it was not only about planets, it was about power. To admit that the heavens contradicted official doctrine was to admit that the Gregorian framework might not be the perfect reflection of reality. For an institution built on the authority to define truth, that was intolerable. Outside of Europe, other civilizations preserved their astronomical data with remarkable precision. The Chinese dynasties, Islamic scholars in Baghdad, and even the Mayans kept records that align with modern calculations. These archives, when compared to Europe's fractured timeline, highlight the inconsistencies. The stars serve as a universal referee, exposing the places where European chronology does not fit. It is one thing for historians to argue about missing documents. It is another for the sky itself to contradict the story. This is why astronomy was both guarded and suppressed within the Vatican. The Church operated its own observatories, collecting data that was rarely shared with the public. By keeping its own astronomical records behind closed doors, it could control which findings were allowed to confirm doctrine and which were quietly hidden. The stars themselves were not the enemy. The problem was what they revealed when their testimony was compared against official time. Even today, the stars remain the silent witnesses that undermine certainty. Every eclipse, every comet, every planetary conjunction is like a page in a cosmic diary that cannot be torn out. And when those pages are matched against the official European timeline, the contradictions whisper of a past that may not be what we think it is. The stars as witnesses remind us that history is fragile, but the heavens are not. They do not take sides, they only tell the truth. And that truth may be the very thing the Vatican fears most, because it cannot be silenced. When you look at a calendar today, it feels natural. 7 days in a week, 12 months in a year, 365 days cycling endlessly. But none of this is truly natural. The sun does not rise in neat blocks of 7, the moon does not divide itself perfectly into 12 cycles, and the stars do not pause every 30 days to mark a new page. These patterns are not written in the heavens. They are written by men, and over centuries they have been imposed on humanity until we forget they were ever choices at all. The 7-day week is perhaps the clearest example. It does not align cleanly with the lunar cycle, nor does it divide evenly into the solar year. Yet it has become universal. Its origins reach back to Babylon, where ancient astrologers tied each day to one of the 7 wandering stars visible in the sky: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Hebrews later adopted the cycle, weaving it into the story of creation itself. By the time Christianity spread across Europe, the 7-day week had become sacred, untouchable, and enforced by religious authority. But it was never natural. It was imposed rhythm, a drumbeat of time designed to serve worship. The 12-month year is no less artificial. The solar year does not divide evenly into 12 cycles of the moon. Lunar calendars, like those of the ancient Chinese, the Islamic world, and even early Europeans, revealed this constantly as months drifted in and out of season. The 12-month structure we follow today is the result of political decisions, first by the Romans, who reorganized their months to honor gods and emperors, and later by the Church, which cemented them into the Gregorian system. What began as a patchwork of lunar and solar guesses hardened into doctrine. People no longer saw it as one choice among many. They saw it as the only way time could exist. Even the naming of days and months shows the fingerprints of power. Saturday, Sunday, and Monday still carry their ancient planetary origins. July honors Julius Caesar, August honors Augustus. Centuries later, these names remain printed in our calendars, echoes of rulers who carved their authority into time itself. Every time we turn a page to July, we repeat a Roman emperor's name, not because the stars demand it, but because men once demanded we never forget. By the Middle Ages, the Church had fused these systems together. Weeks dictated the rhythm of worship, months aligned feasts with agricultural cycles, days were assigned to saints. The structure of time itself became a cage, guiding when people could work, when they could rest, and when they had to obey. What was once fluid became fixed, and questioning it became unthinkable. When you see the neat grid of days, weeks, and months, remember it is not nature's design. It is human invention, shaped by empires and faith, imposed until it feels invisible. The 7-day week and 12-month year are less about the sky and more about control, reminders that the very way we count our lives is a story written by those who claimed the power to measure time. When Christianity spread across Europe, it did not simply replace the old world, it reshaped it, weaving itself into the rhythms people already lived by. Festivals, solstices, and harvest celebrations that had guided communities for centuries were not erased with a single blow. Instead, They were absorbed, renamed, and baptized as Christian feasts. On the surface, this was a clever strategy, making the new faith easier to accept. But beneath the surface, it was something far more powerful. By taking control of the calendar, the Church did not just give people new holidays. It erased the memory of the old ones, rewriting the flow of time itself. Take the winter solstice. For ancient Europeans, this was the longest night of the year, celebrated with fires, feasting, and rituals of rebirth as the sun began its return. The festival carried different names among Celts, Romans, and Germanic tribes, but its meaning was always clear. It was the turning point of the year. Christianity did not abolish this celebration. Instead, it placed Christmas on December 25th, declaring it the birthday of Christ. In doing so, it transformed the rebirth of the sun into the birth of the sun. The old world's memory was not destroyed. It was hidden beneath a new layer of meaning. The spring equinox was another sacred marker. Pagan rituals tied it to fertility, renewal, and the cycles of planting. Christianity did not erase it, but replaced it with Easter, shifting the date according to the moon, but tying it firmly to the idea of resurrection. The eggs and rabbits that still linger today are echoes of fertility rites much older than the Church. Yet few who celebrate stop to think of those origins. The Feast of Easter became a festival of forgetting, its deeper roots buried beneath the authority of doctrine. Even harvest festivals were absorbed. Communities once gathered to thank the earth for its bounty, offering food and drink to local gods and spirits. The Church transformed these into feast days for saints, or festivals of the Virgin Mary. The gratitude remained, but the memory of who was once thanked faded. Over time, generations grew up believing these celebrations had always been Christian, unaware that their ancestors had once danced for gods with different names under the same sun and moon. The strategy was subtle but absolute. By tying every season to a Christian meaning, the Church ensured that people could not step outside its authority. Time itself was sanctified. Every turn of the year brought another reminder that life flowed only through Christ and the saints. To resist was not only to defy the Church, but to stand outside the very rhythm of existence. These festivals of forgetting worked so well that today, most people never question why their holidays fall when they do. They see Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days as timeless, not realizing that behind them lies a world of solstices, equinoxes, and harvests long buried. In the end, the Church did not need to destroy the old cycles. It only needed to cover them with new ones until the past was forgotten. And in that forgetting, time itself was conquered. A child in medieval Europe did not learn to count time by the rising of the sun or the changing of the seasons. They learned it through the sound of church bells and the turning of holy days marked by priests. From the very beginning of life, the calendar was more than a tool. It was a teacher, shaping how a child thought about the world. Instead of learning that the year flowed with the stars or the cycles of harvest, they were taught that it moved according to feast days, saints' days, and the great celebrations of the Church. Time itself became the first lesson in obedience. In villages, children grew up hearing their parents talk about planting, not in terms of moons or rains, but in terms of Easter or Michaelmas. They learned that fasting before Lent was normal, that celebrating on Christmas was expected, and that work was forbidden on dozens of holy days. Each day was not simply a blank square in the turning year. It carried weight, meaning, and rules set by the Church. By the time a child could count, they were already counting time by doctrine. Schools, many of them run by monastic orders, reinforced this rhythm. Children were drilled in the dates of feasts and the lives of saints, as though they were the very structure of history itself. The calendar was used to anchor lessons in Scripture. A boy might not know the phases of the moon, but he knew when the next holy day required him to attend Mass. A girl might not be taught the stars, but she was taught which day belonged to the Virgin Mary. In this way, the Church ensured that from childhood to adulthood, people lived inside a cycle that pointed always back to itself. This indoctrination was subtle. No one told children that time itself was controlled. They simply grew up believing the year had always been shaped this way. They never imagined that before their world, people had counted differently by nature and sky. They did not know that their ancestors had lived by solstices and equinoxes, or that lunar months once guided the rhythms of life. Those memories had been covered by new names, new rituals, and new meanings. What looked eternal was in fact engineered. The power of this system was not in force, but in familiarity. When every child was raised within it, no one questioned it. The bells told them when to pray. The calendar told them when to fast. The festivals told them when to rejoice. To doubt was not simply rebellion against authority. It was rebellion against the very structure of time that shaped their world. And in such a world, rebellion felt impossible. The calendar, as indoctrination, ensured that entire generations grew up seeing time not as a natural cycle, but as a sacred one. Life itself was measured by doctrine, and memory was shaped to forget there had ever been another way. To control the calendar was to control not only the present, but the minds of those who would inherit it. And so children were not simply taught faith. They were taught to live inside it, day after day, year after year, until they no longer saw the difference between time and belief. When European ships sailed across oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, they carried more than soldiers, merchants, and missionaries. They carried their version of time. The Gregorian calendar, created in 1582, was not simply a correction of dates within Europe. It became part of the conquest itself, a quiet weapon that reshaped entire civilizations. Wherever European empires planted their flags, they also planted their calendar, replacing the rhythms of local life with the rhythm of Rome. In the Americas, indigenous peoples measured time by the sun, the moon, and the stars. The Mayans tracked eclipses and cycles with astonishing accuracy, and the Aztecs wove sacred meaning into every turn of their calendar stone. Yet when Spain conquered these lands, such systems were condemned as pagan and destroyed. Christian festivals replaced solstices, and Gregorian dates replaced native reckonings. What had once been a deeply spiritual connection to the cosmos was rewritten as obedience to the church's clock. The people were forced not only to change their gods, but their very measurement of life itself. In Africa, the story was the same. Communities long tied to lunar cycles and seasonal rituals were pressed into counting days by European rules. Missionaries set schools and churches to the rhythm of the 7-day week, teaching children that their ancestors' calendars were superstition. Colonies did not merely lose their land, they lost their sense of time. By erasing traditional calendars, the colonizers cut them off from their own history, forcing them into the grid of a foreign order. Even in Asia, where great civilizations had kept calendars for millennia, the pressure mounted. The Chinese had refined their lunar solar system, the Indians tracked centuries with astonishing astronomical precision, and the Islamic world produced tables that guided both science and prayer. Yet as Europe expanded its trade and influence, nations that wished to interact on equal terms were forced to adopt the Gregorian system. Japan, resisting for centuries, finally switched in the 19th century to prove it was a modern nation. Time itself had become the price of survival in a world now dominated by Europe. The spread of the Gregorian calendar was not seen as violent conquest, but its effects were just as deep. Once adopted, it replaced festivals, erased ancestral rhythms, and rewrote memory. People no longer celebrated their new year under the same stars as their ancestors. They celebrated January 1st, a date chosen not by nature but by decree. Every colony became bound not only by empire, but by the calendar of empire, ticking in unison with Rome and its successors. This conquest of time was more lasting than the conquest of land. Borders could shift and empires could fall, but the calendar remained. Even today, long after colonies gained independence, most of the world still lives under the Gregorian system. The conquest of time succeeded so thoroughly that few question it at all. We do not ask why we count years this way. We simply obey the rhythm we inherited, forgetting it was ever imposed. And in that forgetting, the conquest is complete. Every civilization once carried its own clock. The Islamic world tracked time with lunar precision, guided by observatories in Baghdad and Damascus that mapped the heavens with stunning accuracy. Hindu astronomers in India measured vast cosmic cycles, reckoning ages of creation that stretched far beyond the imagination of Europe. The Mayans carved stone calendars that predicted eclipses and planetary movements for centuries to come. Each of these systems reflected a unique way of seeing reality, binding culture to the cosmos. But as the Gregorian calendar spread with colonization and religious expansion, these other clocks were not merely ignored, they were suppressed, erased, and replaced with the rhythm of Rome. The Islamic calendar, based on the moon, carried both scientific and spiritual importance. Scholars like al-Battani and al-Khwarizmi developed astronomical tables that aligned prayer with celestial cycles and guided navigation across deserts and seas. Yet, when European powers rose, they dismissed the Islamic calendar as primitive because it did not match the solar count of the Gregorian system. In colonies from North Africa to the Middle East, Islamic reckoning was pushed into the private sphere, tolerated only for religious rituals, while all official life was forced to run on Gregorian time. In doing so, empires severed the link between faith and the heavens that had once been at the core of Islamic culture. In India, the suppression was even more striking. Hindu timekeeping reached back thousands of years, with calendars not only tied to lunar and solar cycles, but to yugas, immense cosmic ages, said to measure the rise and fall of worlds. This vision gave people a sense of belonging to an eternal cycle far greater than human empires. But when the British took control, they dismissed these calendars as superstition and replaced them with the Gregorian model. Local systems were fractured, stripped of authority, and made secondary to the official clock of empire. The cosmic vision of time was reduced to a curiosity, while the Gregorian year became law. The Mayan calendar may have faced the harshest erasure. Its intricate system of the long count, the tzolkin, and the harb revealed a profound understanding of cycles that stretched across millennia. Mayan priests could predict eclipses with stunning precision, yet when Spanish conquistadors arrived, they destroyed codices and smashed calendar stones. To the colonizers, Mayan timekeeping was not knowledge but heresy. Entire libraries of astronomical wisdom were burned, leaving only fragments behind. In their place, the people were forced to count time by the 7-day week and 12-month year of Europe, their ancestral rhythms silenced. The erasure of these clocks was more than cultural loss. It was a way to dominate. By taking away a people's way of measuring life, you take away their sense of belonging in the universe. You make them step to your rhythm, live by your feast days, and forget their own. Today, fragments of these systems survive, whispered in rituals and studied by scholars. But the world as a whole ticks to the Gregorian calendar. The Islamic, Hindu, and Mayan clocks were not destroyed by accident. They were pushed aside so one system could reign supreme, turning the diversity of human time into a single imposed beat. The story of modern science is often told as a tale of reason triumphing over faith, of telescopes replacing cathedrals and laboratories rising above monasteries. But hidden beneath that story lies a quiet truth. The very foundation of modernity rests on a clock built by the Vatican. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced his reform in 1582, he was not just fixing Easter, he was setting the rhythm for the future of science itself. The Gregorian calendar, born of church authority, became the universal framework within which modern knowledge would grow. Before the reform, scientists struggled with dates that drifted. The Julian calendar had slipped days away from the solar year, causing confusion in measuring astronomical events and recording natural phenomena. To compare data across decades or nations was nearly impossible when the dates no longer matched the seasons. By enforcing the Gregorian system, the Vatican gave Europe a synchronized clock. This clock became the stage on which science could perform, offering a shared language of time that experiments and observations desperately needed. It is ironic that Galileo, who would later clash with the Church, still relied on its calendar to date his discoveries. Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Newton's experiments with gravity, and later the careful records of chemists and physicists were all marked by Gregorian dates. Without a common measure of time, science would have remained fragmented, each culture tracking days differently, each observation misaligned with the next. The Church's calendar solved this problem, even as it suppressed other forms of truth. Colonial expansion only deepened this effect. As European empires spread across the world, they brought the Gregorian system with them. Local calendars were pushed aside, and official records were stamped with Gregorian dates. What began as papal decree became global law, not just for worship, but for trade, navigation, and eventually scientific collaboration. The voyages of discovery, the mapping of continents, and the cataloguing of species were all recorded on Vatican time. When modern science claimed to be universal, it was standing on the foundation of a universal clock first set in Rome. Even today, the Gregorian calendar remains the silent framework behind scientific progress. International conferences, space missions, and global experiments all rely on its structure. When astronomers log the appearance of a comet, or biologists record the mutation of a virus, they are writing within the rhythm of Gregorian years and months. The calendar has become so natural we rarely question it, yet it is a human invention born of religious authority, still guiding the supposedly secular world of modern knowledge. A universal clock allowed science to flourish, but it also ensured that the Church's hand remained on history. Every discovery, every breakthrough, every chart and log was inscribed within the system Rome had imposed. The irony is sharp. The Vatican, which feared free thought, gave the world the very framework that allowed science to explode. Yet, in doing so, it also ensured that the clock of modernity would forever carry its mark, ticking with the rhythm of a decision made centuries ago in the name of power and prophecy. There is a strange gap at the very heart of our calendar, a silence so deep that most people never notice it. Between the years labelled before Christ and the years labelled Anno Domini, there is no year zero. Historians move directly from 1 BC to 1 AD, as though the number 0 never existed. It seems like a small detail, a quirk of counting, but it is far more than that. The missing year 0 reveals how the calendar was designed not to reflect mathematics or astronomy, but theology and control. The idea of 0 was already known in other cultures, long before Europe accepted it. Ancient Indian mathematicians developed it as both a number and a concept, a placeholder that made advanced calculations possible. The Mayans used 0 in their calendar centuries before Christ. Even Islamic scholars adopted and refined it during the Middle Ages. Yet in Europe, 0 was treated with suspicion. It represented nothingness, a void, a concept too unsettling for a worldview built on divine order. For the Church, time could not begin from nothing, it had to begin from Christ. When the monk Dionysius Exiguus devised the system of counting years in the 6th century, he declared the birth of Jesus as the dividing line. Years before were labelled before Christ, years after were counted as Anno Domini in the year of our Lord. But instead of placing a 0 between them, Dionysius jumped directly from 1 BC to 1 AD. The absence of 0 made the timeline not mathematical but theological. It erased the void and replaced it with the instant arrival of divine presence. Time itself became a declaration that there was no in-between, no nothingness, only the world before Christ and the world after. The consequences of this choice are stranger than they appear. In mathematics, the lack of 0 creates confusion. Astronomers must use a separate numbering system when they calculate planetary cycles, inserting a year 0 to make the math work. Historians sometimes stumble when comparing timelines across cultures because the European system skips a number that others considered essential. The missing year zero is not just an oddity, it is a crack in the very foundation of the calendar, proof that faith shaped its structure more than logic. Why was zero never allowed? Because it threatened doctrine. To admit zero was to admit that nothingness had value, that time could exist without Christ, that a gap might exist between ages of the world. For the Church, such an idea was dangerous. Better to rewrite the flow of years than to leave room for doubt. Better to make the calendar itself a proclamation that history pivots not on emptiness but on divine intervention. Today, every time we say we live in the year 2025 AD, we are echoing that choice. We are counting not from zero, but from a narrative constructed 1500 years ago. The missing year zero is a reminder that even the simplest parts of our calendar are not neutral. They are decisions made by those who wanted time itself to tell a story. And the story they chose was one where nothingness never existed, because only faith was allowed to fill the space between. When the year 1999 ticked toward 2000, the world held its breath. People whispered of planes falling from the sky, banks collapsing, and hidden prophecies unfolding at the stroke of midnight. This fear was given a technical name, Y2K, a computer glitch caused by programs that read the year with only 2 digits. But beneath the headlines of malfunctioning machines lay something far older, a deep unease about the turn of a millennium. The panic that gripped the modern world echoed the terror of the past, when manipulated calendars and shifting dates stirred dread of divine judgment. For centuries, the year 1000 had been wrapped in prophecy. Medieval Europe was told that apocalyptic signs would appear as the first millennium came to an end. Famine, war, and pestilence were read as signals of the end times. Chroniclers wrote of crowds waiting for the sky to split open and Christ to return. Some historians argue that these fears were exaggerated later, but fragments of evidence suggest that ordinary people did live in fear of the year 1000, convinced that history itself was running out of time. This fear did not arise naturally. It was shaped by the very way the calendar was constructed. By tying all of history to the birth of Christ, the Church gave special meaning to the years that ended in hundreds and thousands. Numbers became symbols, and symbols became weapons of control. When the Gregorian reform in 1582 restructured the calendar, it only deepened this perception. Every year became a countdown, not just to Easter or Christmas, but to the fulfillment of prophecy. People believed they were not just living through history. They were living through a timeline designed to align with the divine. Fast forward to the 20th century. Computers, designed to serve the modern age, were built on the same Gregorian framework. When they struggled with the turn from 99 to 00, the panic spread quickly. Was this just a glitch, or was it the long-awaited judgment hidden in the numbers? News outlets replayed the fear, governments spent billions on fixes, and ordinary people stocked food and water, preparing for collapse. The fear was framed as technological, but the reaction revealed something deeper. Humanity still trembled at the idea that time itself might betray them. When midnight arrived, and the year 2000 began without disaster, relief swept the world. Yet the panic left behind an echo of unease. Why had people been so quick to believe in catastrophe? Perhaps because the calendar had always been a stage for fear, stretched and manipulated by power to remind people that they lived on borrowed time. The medieval terror of the first millennium and the modern anxiety of Y2K were not so different. Both were born from a system where numbers on a page carried more weight than the stars above. Millennium panic is a reminder that the calendar is not just a tool. It is a script, one that can stir dread as easily as it can mark days. Whether in the year 1000 or 2000, people have lived with the haunting sense that time is not neutral but manipulated, carrying hidden meanings that may one day demand a price. And in that fear, the past still lingers. The Gregorian calendar is often presented as the perfect solution to the chaos of earlier systems, the master correction that finally aligned human time with the heavens. Yet hidden within it are flaws that even its creators could not escape. Leap years, those curious extra days we add to February, are the most visible sign of this imperfection. They are a patch, a reminder that the system we live by is not truly natural but a careful compromise. And like all compromises, it carries cracks that widen over centuries. The problem begins with the year itself. The Earth does not orbit the Sun in exactly 365 days. It takes about 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds. That small difference may seem harmless, but across decades it adds up. Under the old Julian calendar, which gave every fourth year an extra day, the error was too large. It created a drift of about 11 minutes each year, pushing the seasons further and further away from their rightful place. By the 16th century, spring was arriving 10 days earlier than the calendar claimed, a crisis that sparked the Gregorian reform. The new system was more precise. It kept the leap year rule but added an exception. Years divisible by 100 would not be leap years unless they were also divisible by 400. This adjustment brought the error much closer to zero, trimming the drift to just 26 seconds per year. Over centuries, this still accumulates. By the year 4000, if humanity is still counting Gregorian time, the calendar will be about a full day out of sync with the sun. This hidden flaw raises unsettling questions. If the Gregorian calendar was meant to be eternal, why does it still fall short? If the Church truly controlled time, why accept a system that leaves cracks for future generations to find? Some argue that the imperfections were known but ignored because the reform was less about accuracy and more about authority. It was not about creating a flawless clock. It was about proving that Rome had the power to reset the days. Even now, scientists sometimes debate whether the calendar should be adjusted again. Proposals have been made for new systems, calendars with perfectly even months or built on atomic precision. Yet none have been adopted. The Gregorian framework remains, not because it is perfect, but because it is entrenched. It governs holidays, legal contracts, international trade, and daily life. To change it would be to admit that the story of time we have followed for centuries is not final, and that is something few powers are willing to do. Leap years are not just curiosities. They are reminders that our calendar is a human invention, trying to contain the vast rhythm of the cosmos. Each extra day in February whispers that the system is fragile, patched together, and imperfect. And if such errors still exist, it forces us to wonder how much else in our timeline is flawed, hidden behind the illusion of precision. The Gregorian calendar may seem unshakable, but even it carries the seeds of its own unravelling. Deep beneath Vatican City lies a labyrinth of shelves, stretching for miles, holding manuscripts and records that few eyes have ever seen. Among these countless volumes are documents that detail the earliest debates about time itself. The Vatican's secret archives, despite their name, are not fiction. They are real, carefully guarded, and almost entirely closed to the public. What is stored within them has long been the subject of speculation. And when it comes to the history of calendars, many suspect that the Church is hiding far more than dusty old charts of feast days. When Pope Gregory XIII announced his reform in 1582, it was presented as the product of brilliant mathematics and divine guidance. But calendars are not built overnight. They are argued, tested, and revised across decades. Where are the records of those arguments? Where are the drafts of the reforms that came before Gregory's final decree? Officially, most of those documents have never been seen. Scholars are told they exist somewhere in the archives, but access is nearly impossible. One must request a specific document by name, and even then, only a select few are granted permission. The question becomes clear: If there is nothing to hide, why the silence? Whispers among historians suggest that the archives may contain proposals that show just how fragile the Gregorian reform truly was. Alternative calendars were likely considered, perhaps ones that would have revealed the flaws of both Julian and Gregorian systems. Records might exist showing disagreements among Jesuit astronomers, their doubts erased from public history to maintain the illusion of unity. Letters between popes and emperors could expose how much the reform was driven by politics, empire, and prophecy, rather than pure science. To release such documents would not only challenge the story of Gregory's brilliance, it would reveal the machinery of power that stood behind his calendar. Some even claim that the archives hold manuscripts that do not fit the accepted European timeline at all. Reports of eclipses, astronomical records, or chronicles of missing years may lie sealed in vaults, carefully kept out of reach because they would clash with the official chronology. If evidence surfaced showing that centuries were fabricated or that astronomical events contradict the Gregorian system, the entire structure of history, as we know it, would shake. That possibility alone makes secrecy convenient. What we are told of the archives is only the surface. 50 miles of shelving, over 1 million documents, but less than a fraction ever opened to the world. Scholars allowed inside often describe frustration. They may be granted a single manuscript for a short time under supervision, with no chance to explore freely. The Church insists this is for preservation, but many suspect it is for control. The Vatican archives of time remain locked, and with them the possibility of truths too disruptive to reveal. What debates were silenced? What doubts were erased? What alternatives were buried? Until those shelves are opened, we may never know. And perhaps that is the point. If history itself is built on the control of time, then the greatest secret is not what lies within the archives. It is why we are not allowed to see it. What if the year we believe we live in is not the real one? What if humanity's true age is older, stranger, and hidden behind layers of edited time? Across the world, fragments of alternative dating systems suggest that the timeline we have inherited through the Gregorian calendar may not be the only one, nor the most accurate. These forbidden timelines whisper of civilizations far older than our history books, admit and hint that the world we call modern might in fact be standing on the ruins of ages long forgotten. Take the Hindu system of time. In India, astronomers and priests measured not just years or centuries, but vast cycles called yugas. A single yuga stretched for hundreds of thousands of years, and together they formed Mahayugas lasting millions. According to this vision, humanity has existed far longer than the few thousand years the Western calendar suggests. We are said to live in the Kali Yuga, an age of decline, but even this is part of an endless cycle where countless ages came before. If this timeline is true, then the Gregorian calendar has shrunk humanity's memory to a fraction of its true scope. The Mayan long count offers another perspective. By tracking days across a cycle of over 5,000 years, the Mayans believed they were recording the heartbeat of the cosmos itself. Their calculations of eclipses and planetary alignments were so precise that modern astronomers still marvel at them. Yet, when Europeans arrived, they dismissed the long count as superstition and destroyed most of the codices. What survived suggests that the Mayans placed human history inside a far greater span of time, one that did not begin with the birth of Christ, but stretched back into forgotten ages. Even the Byzantine and Ethiopian calendars present challenges. The Byzantine reckoning dated creation to the year 5500 before Christ, making the current year thousands ahead of the Gregorian count. The Ethiopian calendar still runs 7 years behind the rest of the world, meaning that for them, the year 2025 has not yet arrived. These variations reveal that the very idea of what year it is depends entirely on who holds the authority to declare it. Some modern scholars argue that the missing centuries in European history, as suggested by the phantom time hypothesis, might connect directly to these alternative systems. If years were erased or fabricated to align with biblical prophecy, then the Gregorian calendar is less a neutral clock and more a curated version of time. Perhaps the reason forbidden timelines were suppressed is not that they were wrong, but that they made the official story impossible to sustain. If humanity's true age is far older than we are taught, then our story must be rewritten. Civilizations may have risen and fallen long before the official beginning of history. Knowledge we think of as new may be rediscoveries of things once known, and the Gregorian system, neat and unquestioned, may only be a thin veil drawn over the vastness of time. The forbidden timelines remind us of a dangerous truth. We may not really know how old we are. From the moment we wake up and glance at the calendar, we are stepping into a story that was written for us centuries ago. Every date we read, every holiday we mark, every year we count has been shaped by choices made in the shadows of history. The question is not only whether those choices were accurate, but who had the authority to make them. If time itself has been rewritten, then history is not what happened, it is what the Vatican decided we should remember. The Gregorian calendar has become so universal that we forget it is not natural. It is not carved into the stars or etched into the cycles of the earth. It is a system imposed, a framework constructed, and above all, a story told. For centuries, the Church held the power to declare what day it was, when Easter would fall, and even what year humanity lived in. By controlling the clock, they controlled memory. And memory is the soil from which history grows. If the calendar can be shifted, if centuries can be erased or inserted, then the past becomes clay in the hands of those who mould it. Imagine if a ruler could legitimize his throne by aligning his reign with prophecy, or if a church could strengthen its authority by erasing centuries of stagnation. The manipulation of time is not a minor correction. It is the most powerful form of rewriting reality itself, and once rewritten, generations live inside it without question, believing they are free while they walk within a cage of numbers. The silence of the archives only deepens the mystery. Locked away in the Vatican are shelves of manuscripts and debates that could reveal the true history of our calendar, but they remain sealed. We are told what we need to know, nothing more. It is not simply about preserving fragile documents. It is about preserving control, for if time is the foundation of history, then whoever holds the clock holds the world. Think of what has been forgotten: pagan festivals transformed into Christian feasts, alternative calendars dismissed as superstition, missing centuries buried in the fog of the so-called Dark Ages, astronomical records ignored when they contradicted the official timeline. Each of these fragments points to the same conclusion. Time has been carefully sculpted, not discovered. And so the final question is not what year it truly is, or how many centuries may be missing. The final question is who benefits? Who gains when people accept without doubt that today is this date, that this year marks this age, that history flows in a neat line from Rome to now? The answer is simple. Power benefits, authority benefits. The institution that holds the clock benefits most of all. Perhaps history is not a record of the past, but a script written to guide the present. Perhaps time itself has been edited, erased, and repainted to keep us aligned with a narrative not of our choosing. And if that is true, then we must ask the most dangerous question of all. Do we live in history, or do we live in memory, carefully designed to make us forget what truly happened? The clock is ticking, but whose hand winds it?